Mama, can we please keep the milk? I promise I'll only drink a little bit each day. Maybe just on Sundays?
Mija, we talked about this. The medicine for your cough is more important right now. Mrs. Eleanor next door, she has some milk we can borrow tomorrow, okay?
But Mama, you haven't had your coffee in 6 days. And you get those sad lines around your eyes when you don't have coffee.
Don't worry, honey. We'd get your formula. Some things are more important than what Mama wants. My dear, some things are more important.
In that moment, standing a few meters away in the local grocery store, two worlds were about to collide in a way that would change not just two lives, but an entire community. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the smallest acts of sacrifice, and sometimes the people who seem to have everything are actually the ones who have lost the most. What happened next didn't just shock everyone who witnessed it. It started a chain reaction that would reveal secrets, challenge assumptions, and prove that sometimes the universe has a way of bringing together exactly the people who need each other most. This is a story about a millionaire who thought he had nothing left to give, and a mother who had already given everything. But before we dive into what David Chen did that stunned an entire town, we need to understand how both of these people ended up in that grocery store on that Tuesday evening. Because the truth is, they had more in common than anyone could have imagined. Welcome back, my lovely family. I trust everyone is fine. And if you're new here, please tap the subscribe button so you don't miss the next story, because it would definitely touch your heart. Our stories are stories of real people facing real struggles, achieving real results, and in unexpected ways we lift each other up. If this is the exact kind of stories you love, then you're exactly that kind of person that makes this community special. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If this story doesn't meet your expectations, please tell us in the comments as well. I wish our incredibly heartwarming stories bring you glad tidings now and always. Thank you. As Maria Santos guided her daughter toward the store exit, her shoulders carried more than just the weight of a nearly empty shopping bag. They carried 3 years of 12-hour shifts, sleepless nights spent budgeting pennies, and the constant ache of wanting to give her child everything but having almost nothing to give. Behind them, David Chen stood frozen in line, his $200 organic groceries suddenly feeling obscene in his cart. The interaction he'd just witnessed had shattered something inside him, something that had been carefully protected by wealth, success, and the comfortable distance money creates from other people's pain. Outside the store, Maria knelt down to Sofia's level, wiping away a tear from her daughter's cheek. Her voice was steady but strained as she explained that they had gotten everything they really needed: the medicine, rice and beans for the week, and most importantly, each other. But 7-year-old Sofia already understood struggle in a way that most adults never would. She'd learned to count coins before she could properly tie her shoes, learned that maybe tomorrow usually meant probably never, and learned that her mother's happiness always came last. At the checkout, the cashier asked David if he'd be paying with credit or debit, but he was distracted, watching through the window as Maria and Sofia disappeared into the parking lot. The cashier noticed his expression and asked if he was all right. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. David's quiet response of something like that carried the weight of recognition, because in that moment, he had seen something he'd been avoiding for 2 years: genuine human need. David Chen hadn't always been distracted by other people's problems. After his divorce, after losing custody of his daughter Emma, he'd built his entire life around avoiding them. He'd thrown himself into his tech company with a single-minded focus that had made him worth $47 million and left him with a penthouse apartment he barely lived in and a phone that rarely rang with personal calls. In the parking lot, Maria's 17-year-old Honda Civic coughed twice before the engine turned over. The air conditioning had died last summer, the radio only picked up 2 stations clearly, and the passenger side window was held up with duct tape. But it was theirs, paid for with overtime shifts and birthday money Sofia had insisted on contributing from her own piggy bank. As they sat in the car, Sofia asked her mother a question that nearly broke Maria's heart. Do you think God forgets about people sometimes? She wondered if maybe God had too many people to think about, and he forgot about the little ones like them. Maria had been asked difficult questions before: why Sofia's father wasn't around, why she didn't finish nursing school, why she didn't just find a better job. But this question from her 7-year-old daughter about whether God had forgotten them was almost too much to bear. Maria's response was gentle but firm. God doesn't forget anyone. Sometimes his plan just takes longer than we think it should, and sometimes he sends help in ways we don't expect. She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. Meanwhile, David sat in his Mercedes, engine running, air conditioning humming quietly. He'd pulled out his phone 3 times to call his assistant, to have her research the woman and child he'd just observed. Each time, he'd put the phone back down. This felt different from the charitable donations he usually made, tax-deductible gifts to organizations where he never had to see individual faces or hear specific stories. The truth was, David had been thinking about his daughter Emma more lately. She was 9 now, living with her mother in Portland, and their monthly video calls had become increasingly awkward. Emma would show him her drawings, tell him about school, but there was a distance there that all his money couldn't bridge. He'd missed too many bedtime stories, too many scraped knees, too many moments that mattered. 18 months earlier, during his divorce proceedings, his ex-wife Jennifer had said something that still woke him up at night. "You're generous with your money, David, but you've forgotten how to be generous with yourself. Emma doesn't need another toy or college fund contribution. She needs a father who shows up." He'd promised to do better, attended every soccer game for 2 months. Then a major acquisition demanded his attention, and showing up became calling in, and calling in became sending gifts, and sending gifts became the relationship he'd sworn he wouldn't have with his daughter. Watching Maria and Sofia drive away in their struggling Honda, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the desire to help not because it was good business or good publicity, but because someone needed help and he had the power to provide it. The Santos family lived in a second-floor walk-up in a neighborhood where rent was cheap because everything else, safety, schools, opportunities, came at a premium elsewhere. Maria had chosen this place because it was within walking distance of both her jobs: morning shifts at the diner on Maple Street, evening shifts cleaning offices downtown. As they climbed the worn stairs, Sofia noticed their neighbor Mrs. Eleanor's light was on. Eleanor Martinez, a silver-haired woman in her 70s, had been watching over the Santos family since they moved in 18 months ago. She'd raised 4 children as a single mother herself back in the 1980s, and she recognized the signs: the careful budgeting, the tired smile, the way a mother's shoulders carry the weight of constantly choosing between necessary things. Before Maria could knock, Mrs. Eleanor opened her door with the announcement that she'd bought too much milk and made too much soup. Would they be doing her a favor by helping her with the excess? This was the daily dance of dignity between neighbors who understood each other. Mrs. Eleanor had too much of whatever the Santos family needed most, and Maria accepted these gifts only when they were framed as favors she was doing for her elderly neighbor. Inside Mrs. Eleanor's warm apartment, Sofia curled up on the familiar couch with her stuffed rabbit and asked if people could be angels sometimes. She'd noticed the man behind them in line at the store. He had kind eyes, and when her mother was sad about the milk, he looked sad too, like he wanted to help but didn't know how. Children see things that adults often miss. They notice kindness before it becomes action, hope before it becomes reality. Maria's response reflected her fierce independence. People can be kind, but they couldn't wait for others to solve their problems. They solved them themselves one day at a time. But Mrs. Eleanor offered a gentle counterpoint. Sometimes we let people help us, not because we can't handle things alone, but because everyone needs to feel useful sometimes. At that same moment, in his penthouse apartment 37 floors above the city, David was having his nightly video call with Emma. His apartment was everything a successful bachelor's home should be: sleek, modern, and absolutely silent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view that real estate agents called breathtaking, and David had stopped noticing 2 years ago. Emma was working on a school project about heroes and asked her father to tell her about someone who was his hero, not a famous person, but someone real, someone he actually knew. David struggled with the question, realized with cold clarity that he couldn't name a single person in his personal life who he considered heroic. His world had become populated by business associates, service providers, and occasional social acquaintances. When had he stopped knowing people who inspired him? When David asked for time to think about it, Emma's disappointed, "Sure, Dad," carried the weight of too many postponed conversations, too many promises to get back to her later. After she said she loved him and hung up, David sat in his expensive silence, thinking about two people, his daughter who was looking for heroes, and a little girl who'd offered to drink only a little bit of milk if her mother could afford to buy it. For the first time in months, David felt something that all his success couldn't purchase: purpose. Back in the Santos apartment, the bedtime routine was underway. As Maria braided Sofia's hair, her daughter made a promise that would have broken most hearts. When she grew up, she was going to buy her mother so much coffee that she'd never have sad lines around her eyes again. But Maria's response revealed the wisdom that poverty can teach. The best things in life aren't things you can buy. She listed them for Sofia, the way her daughter made her laugh when trying to help with cooking, how Sofia always shared her snacks with Mrs. Eleanor, how she stayed brave even when things were scary. Maria Santos was teaching her daughter something that David Chen had forgotten somewhere between his first million and his last board meeting, that wealth isn't measured only in dollars, and that being rich has more to do with what you give than what you have. At 10:47 that Tuesday night, as Sofia Santos fell asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit and dreaming of a world where her mother never had to choose between milk and medicine, David Chen made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant Marcus. His instructions were simple. He needed something done first thing tomorrow morning, and this one was personal. Because sometimes, the universe doesn't just bring together people who need each other. Sometimes it creates the exact circumstances necessary for healing to begin, not just for the people receiving help, but for the people learning how to give it. What David Chen was planning would indeed shock everyone who witnessed it. But the real surprise wasn't what he was about to do for Maria and Sofia Santos. The real surprise was what they were about to do for him. Because in that grocery store checkout line, watching a mother choose medicine over milk, David had glimpsed something he thought he'd lost forever: the possibility of becoming the kind of person his daughter could call a hero. And sometimes, that's exactly where the most extraordinary transformations begin, with one person deciding that someone else's pain matters more than their own comfort, and that the distance between strangers is just an invitation waiting to be crossed. Marcus Rivera had been David Chen's executive assistant for 4 years, and in that time, he'd arranged everything from hostile corporate takeovers to David's mother's funeral. But the call he'd received at 10:47 the previous night was different. David's voice had carried something Marcus rarely heard from his boss: uncertainty mixed with desperate determination. The instructions had been specific but puzzling. Find everything about a woman named Maria Santos and her daughter Sofia, who frequented the Riverside Grocery on Elm Street. No publicity, no corporate involvement, and absolute discretion. David had emphasized that last part twice, which told Marcus this wasn't about business at all. By 7 a.m., Marcus had assembled a file that painted a picture of quiet heroism and invisible struggle. Maria Elena Santos, 32 years old, had been working 2 jobs for the past 3 years. Her employment record showed the dedication of someone fighting for survival. Never missed a shift at Murphy's Diner, never late for her evening cleaning job at the Riverside office complex. Her credit report told a different story: medical bills from Sofia's premature birth, student loans from her incomplete nursing degree, and the careful juggling act of someone who paid rent first and everything else with whatever remained. But it was the details Marcus uncovered through his network of contacts that revealed the true depth of Maria's situation. The diner manager, Tom Rodriguez, had quietly mentioned that Maria often worked through her breaks, and that she'd never once eaten a full meal during her shifts, always claiming she wasn't hungry while carefully wrapping leftover toast in napkins to take home. The night janitor at the office complex revealed that Maria had been bringing Sofia with her to work after the girl's babysitter moved away 6 months ago. Every evening from 6 p.m. to midnight, 7-year-old Sofia would sit in the break room doing homework or sleeping on a makeshift bed of cleaning towels while her mother scrubbed floors and emptied trash bins 30 floors below. What Marcus found next made him pause in his research. Sofia's school records showed something remarkable. Despite the chaos of her home situation, the child was an honor student. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had noted in her file that Sofia was unusually mature and empathetic, often sharing her lunch with classmates who had forgotten theirs, despite clearly having little food herself. There was more. Sofia had been recommended for the school's gifted program, but Maria had declined. The reason, according to the school counselor Dr. Patricia Hill, was heartbreaking in its simplicity. The program required transportation to a different school, and Maria's Honda was too unreliable for the daily trip. As Marcus compiled his report, he began to understand why David's voice had carried that strange note of urgency. This wasn't just about helping someone in need, this was about a family that was drowning quietly, without complaint, while maintaining a dignity that put most people to shame. David arrived at his office earlier than usual, the file Marcus had prepared burning in his hands like evidence of his own inadequacy. For 2 years, he'd driven past that grocery store twice a week on his way home from work. How many times had Maria and Sofia been there, making impossible choices, while he remained obliviously insulated in his climate-controlled luxury vehicle? The photographs Marcus had obtained showed David just how carefully Maria had been hiding their situation. In pictures from Sofia's school events, both mother and daughter were always impeccably dressed, clothes that were clearly secondhand but maintained with the precision of someone who understood that appearance often determined how people treated you. Maria's smile in every photo was radiant, genuine, showing no trace of the exhaustion she must have been carrying. David found himself studying one particular image, Sofia at her school's science fair, standing proudly next to a volcano project made from what appeared to be household items and boundless creativity. Maria stood behind her daughter, one hand on Sofia's shoulder, her face glowing with pride that no amount of money could purchase. It was the look David remembered seeing on his own mother's face when he'd won his first programming competition at age 12. But it was Sofia's project title that stopped David cold. How Pressure Creates Diamonds. According to the accompanying report, Sofia had explained to judges that just like coal becomes diamonds under extreme pressure, people can become stronger and more beautiful when life gets difficult. She'd won first place. David's phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Dad, still thinking about your hero? I found mine. It's Mom, because she works hard and still makes time for me every day." The message hit David like a physical blow. His 9-year-old daughter had found her hero in the very person he'd failed to appreciate, while he sat in his office learning about strangers who embodied the kind of strength he'd forgotten existed. The memory came flooding back unbidden. David's last fight with Jennifer hadn't been about money or infidelity or any of the dramatic reasons marriages usually end. It had been about a school play. Emma was playing a tree in her second-grade production of The Seasons, and David had missed it for a board meeting that could have been rescheduled. Jennifer had been waiting for him when he got home, still in her dress from the performance, Emma's costume laid out on the kitchen counter like evidence in a trial. "She kept looking for you in the audience," Jennifer had said, her voice eerily calm. Every time the curtain opened, her eyes would scan the crowd. "I watched our daughter's face fall each time she didn't see you there." David had tried to explain about the merger, about the 40 jobs that hung in the balance, about responsibilities that extended beyond their family. But Jennifer's response had cut deeper than any business rival ever could. "When did you start believing that everyone else's needs mattered more than your own daughter's? When did you decide that being important to strangers was more valuable than being present for the people who love you?" The divorce papers had been filed 3 weeks later. Not because Jennifer stopped loving him, but because Emma deserved better than a part-time father who scheduled affection around quarterly projections. Looking at Maria's file, David recognized something he'd been too proud to admit. This single mother working 2 jobs had figured out how to prioritize in a way that he, with all his resources and advantages, had failed to master. She had less than nothing, yet Sofia clearly felt like the center of her mother's universe. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Chen, your 9 a.m. is here." David looked at his calendar, a meeting with potential investors, people who would hang on his every word because his opinions could make or break their financial futures. 6 months ago, this would have energized him. Today, it felt hollow. David made a decision that would have shocked his business partners. He canceled his morning meetings. All of them. Instead, he drove to Riverside Elementary School, where Sofia Santos was probably sitting in her 2nd grade classroom, unaware that her volcano project about pressure-creating diamonds was about to become prophetic in ways she couldn't imagine. Maria's morning shift at Murphy's Diner started the same way it had for 3 years. Arrive 15 minutes early, tie her apron with hands that still ached from the previous night's cleaning work, and smile like she hadn't gotten only 4 hours of sleep. The regular customers knew her name, tipped generously when they could, and pretended not to notice when she quietly pocketed leftover bacon or toast. Tom Rodriguez, the diner manager, had been watching Maria struggle for months. He'd grown up poor himself, recognized the signs of someone rationing their own meals to make sure their child had enough. More than once, he'd accidentally made extra breakfast sandwiches that would otherwise go to waste, ensuring Maria could take them home. This morning, Tom noticed something different about Maria's usual routine. She kept glancing at the door as if expecting someone, and her smile seemed more forced than usual. During her break, he found her in the alley behind the diner, staring at her phone with tears in her eyes. The text message Maria had received was from Sofia's school. Due to a heating system malfunction, students were being sent home early. Maria's mind raced through impossible logistics. She couldn't leave work. Missing a shift meant losing pay they desperately needed. Mrs. Eleanor was at her weekly doctor's appointment. The after-school program cost money Maria didn't have. For the first time in 3 years, Maria Santos felt the walls of her carefully constructed survival plan beginning to crumble. She had prepared for many emergencies, but not this one. Not the simple impossibility of being in 2 places at once when both places demanded her presence. David Chen sat in his Mercedes outside Sofia's school, watching 7-year-olds stream out of the building into the arms of waiting parents and caregivers. He felt like a voyeur, observing a world of normalcy he'd forgotten existed. These weren't power lunches or board meetings. These were simply adults making sure children felt safe and loved. Then he saw her, Sofia Santos, walking slowly toward the street, her backpack bouncing with each step, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in one arm. But instead of running toward a waiting parent, she was walking toward the bus stop, alone. David watched as she sat on the bench, pulled out a flip phone that looked like it belonged in a museum, and tried to make a call. Through his open window, David could hear fragments of Sofia's conversation with herself, the way children do when they're processing something difficult. "It's okay, Mama's just working. Mrs. Eleanor said she'd be home at 3. I can wait at the library. Miss Johnson said I could always wait at the library." David's heart clenched as he watched this 5-year-old child calmly problem-solve her abandonment, making contingency plans with the competence of someone twice her age. This was what poverty looked like when it wore the mask of resilience, children forced to become adults before they'd finished being children. He was reaching for his door handle when Sofia's phone rang. Even from 30 feet away, David could see her face light up. "Mama? Yes, I'm okay. No, don't cry, Mama. Mrs. Eleanor texted me. She's coming to get me. Yes, I'll wait right here. I love you too." But David could see what Sofia couldn't. Mrs. Eleanor was nowhere in sight, and the elderly woman was walking with a cane, clearly struggling with her own mobility issues as she tried to reach the school. The math was simple. Sofia would be waiting alone for at least another 20 minutes, and Mrs. Eleanor might not make it at all. This was the moment David Chen had been unconsciously preparing for since that previous evening in the grocery store. Not a grand gesture or a corporate donation, but a simple human choice. Walk away and preserve the comfortable distance between himself and other people's problems, or step across an invisible line and acknowledge that sometimes being wealthy means being responsible. David got out of his car. As he walked toward the bus stop, he realized he had no plan, no script, no guarantee that his intervention would be welcome or appropriate. All he had was the memory of a little girl offering to drink less milk so her mother could have coffee, and the growing certainty that some opportunities to help don't come twice. Sofia looked up as his shadow fell across her bench. Her eyes widened with recognition, not fear, but the innocent curiosity of a child who'd been taught to be polite to strangers while staying safely cautious. In that moment, looking down at Maria Santos sitting alone on a bench with her stuffed rabbit and her impossible composure, David Chen understood something that all his business success had never taught him. Sometimes the most important investments you make are in people whose names will never appear on a stock ticker, whose stories will never make the news, whose quiet heroism happens in bus stops and grocery stores and anywhere else ordinary people do extraordinary things just to survive. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that neither David nor Maria could have anticipated. Because helping people isn't just about solving their immediate problems, it's about discovering that in the process of healing someone else's life, you might accidentally find the missing pieces of your own. And sometimes, the people you think you're rescuing turn out to be the ones who save you. As David approached the bus stop, Sofia Santos looked up with the same curious eyes he'd noticed in the grocery store, eyes that seemed to carry more wisdom than any 5-year-old should possess. She clutched her stuffed rabbit closer, not out of fear, but with the instinctive caution her mother had taught her about talking to strangers. David knelt down to her eye level, keeping a respectful distance. His voice, usually commanding in boardrooms, became gentle, uncertain. He told Sofia that he'd noticed her waiting alone and wondered if she needed help getting home safely. It was such a simple offer, yet it carried the weight of David's first genuine human connection in months. Sofia's response revealed both her maturity and her innocence. She explained that her mama was at work, that Mrs. Eleanor was coming to get her, and that she knew how to wait safely because Mama had taught her all the rules. She wasn't afraid, she said, because Mama had taught her that good people still existed in the world. You just had to be smart about recognizing them. Then Sofia did something that stopped David's heart. She looked at him with those impossibly perceptive eyes and said, "You're the man from the grocery store yesterday. You looked sad when Mama had to put back the milk." It wasn't an accusation or a plea for help. It was simply an observation from a child who'd learned to notice when adults were hurting too. David felt exposed in a way that no business competitor had ever managed. This 7-year-old had seen through his expensive suit and luxury car to recognize something he'd barely admitted to himself, that watching Maria's sacrifice had awakened something in him that success had buried. He was indeed sad, sadder than he'd realized, and not just about the milk. When Mrs. Eleanor finally arrived, moving carefully with her cane, Sofia introduced David as the kind man from yesterday. The elderly woman studied David with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent 70 years learning to read people's intentions. Her nod of approval carried more weight than any board of directors vote David had ever received. As he watched Mrs. Eleanor and Sofia walk away together, the elderly woman's protective arm around the child's shoulders, David made a series of phone calls that would change everything. But his plan wasn't what anyone would expect from a millionaire trying to help a struggling family. It wasn't about writing a check or making a grand gesture. It was about something far more complex and potentially devastating: dignity. Back in his office, David spread out a plan that would have impressed his most demanding clients. He'd learned from his divorce that good intentions without careful execution could destroy the very things you're trying to protect. Maria Santos had survived 3 years of poverty through sheer determination and pride, The last thing she needed was some wealthy stranger making her feel like a charity case. David's research had revealed something crucial. Maria wasn't just poor, she was invisibly poor. She'd managed to maintain the appearance of stability through careful planning, strategic sacrifice, and the kind of creative problem-solving that business schools tried to teach but rarely achieved. She was, David realized, better at resource management than most of his corporate executives. The plan David devised was intricate, designed to look like coincidence rather than intervention. First, he would create opportunities that Maria could earn rather than receive. The office building where she cleaned at night was actually managed by a subsidiary of one of David's companies, a connection he'd discovered that morning. It would be simple enough to create a maintenance supervisor position with a salary that would eliminate Maria's need for 2 jobs. But David's plan went deeper than employment. He'd learned that Sofia's exceptional academic performance was being wasted due to transportation issues and financial constraints. Through his network of contacts in the educational sector, David began orchestrating what would appear to be a series of fortunate discoveries. Sofia would be selected for multiple academic programs, complete with transportation provided by the school district's new initiative for gifted students. The medical bills that were strangling Maria's budget would be addressed through a clerical error discovered by the hospital's billing department, an error that would result in most of her debt being forgiven due to previously unapplied financial aid. David's connections in the healthcare industry made this adjustment not just possible, but believable. Even Maria's unreliable Honda would be addressed through an elaborate coincidence. The local garage where she occasionally took her car for repairs would discover that her vehicle qualified for a manufacturer's recall program that would cover most of the necessary repairs. Each element of David's plan was designed to preserve Maria's dignity while systematically removing the barriers that kept her family trapped in poverty. It was manipulation, yes, but manipulation in service of someone else's happiness rather than his own profit. For David, it felt like the first time his strategic thinking had been applied to something that truly mattered. Maria was refilling coffee cups during the lunch rush when Tom Rodriguez approached her with news that seemed too good to be true. A representative from the office complex where she worked nights had called the diner looking for her. Apparently, they wanted to offer her a promotion to a day shift supervisor position that would pay nearly 3 times her current combined income from both jobs. The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly timed, that Maria's first instinct was suspicion. Good things didn't just happen to people like her. There had to be a catch, a hidden cost, some reason why this opportunity was being offered to someone with an incomplete education and no management experience. But Tom Rodriguez vouched for the caller's legitimacy. The office building's management company was well known, the position was real, and they'd specifically requested Maria based on her reliability and work ethic. Her night supervisor had recommended her, they said, noting her punctuality, thoroughness, and the respect she'd earned from other staff members. What Maria didn't know was that her night supervisor had received a very generous consulting fee to provide that recommendation, and that the new supervisor position had been created that very morning by a subsidiary company whose ultimate ownership traced back to David Chen's investment portfolio. As Maria stared at the phone number written on the order pad, her hands trembling with a mixture of hope and terror, she felt the first crack in the carefully constructed wall of self-reliance she'd built around herself and Sofia. Accepting help had always felt like admitting defeat, but this wasn't help. This was an opportunity she could earn through her own merit. At Riverside General Hospital, Maria's file was being reviewed by a billing specialist who had discovered a series of errors in how her account had been processed. According to the specialist's findings, Maria had been incorrectly denied financial assistance that should have covered Sofia's premature birth expenses and subsequent medical care. The billing adjustment would eliminate nearly 80% of the medical debt that had been crushing Maria's budget for 3 years. The specialist explained that the hospital's new patient advocacy program had been systematically reviewing old accounts to correct these kinds of oversights that had prevented deserving families from receiving the assistance they qualified for. What the billing specialist didn't mention was that this patient advocacy program had been funded by an anonymous donation large enough to cover not just Maria's debt, but similar adjustments for dozens of other families in comparable situations. The donor had specified that the assistance should be presented as corrected billing rather than charity, understanding that dignity was often more valuable than money. At Martinez Auto Repair, where Maria had been taking her struggling Honda for patchwork fixes she could barely afford, owner Roberto Martinez was making a phone call that would seem like a miracle to his customer. Maria's car, it turned out, was part of a manufacturer's recall program that had been poorly publicized, a recall that would cover most of the repairs her vehicle desperately needed. Roberto had discovered this recall through a routine check of manufacturer databases, something he definitely hadn't been doing regularly until a mysterious consultant had suggested it might be good business practice to keep customers informed about such opportunities. The consultant had even provided software that would automatically search for recalls and warranty extensions. The timing was perfect. Maria's car had been making concerning noises for weeks, and she'd been dreading the moment when it would finally break down completely, leaving her unable to get to work or transport Sofia to school. This recall would not only fix her current problems but prevent future ones. As Maria finished her shift at the diner, her mind was reeling from the series of impossible coincidences that had transformed her day. A job promotion that doubled her income, academic opportunities for Sofia that included transportation, medical debt forgiveness, and car repairs covered by warranty. It was too much good fortune for one family that had been struggling for so long. Maria Santos had survived poverty by being realistic about the world's capacity for kindness. Good things happen to other people, to families with connections and advantages she didn't possess. When good things happen to people like her, there was usually a hidden cost that revealed itself later. But as she drove home in her struggling Honda, listening to Sofia excitedly describe her special school tests and the new programs she might qualify for, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: hope. Not the desperate hope of someone wishing for a miracle, but the cautious optimism of someone who might actually have a future worth planning for. What Maria didn't realize was that David Chen was experiencing something equally unfamiliar. For the first time since his divorce, he was using his wealth and influence to create something beautiful instead of just accumulating more success. Every phone call he made, every string he pulled, every favor he called and was making him feel more connected to his own humanity. But the most crucial element of David's plan was still to come. Because helping Maria and Sofia from a distance, through anonymous interventions and orchestrated coincidences, was only the beginning. The real challenge would be finding a way to become part of their lives without destroying the very independence and dignity that made them so remarkable. And David was about to discover that Maria Santos was far more perceptive than he'd anticipated. Because people who survive by being observant don't miss patterns, even when those patterns are designed by someone with the resources to make coincidences look convincing. Sometimes, the most beautiful stories are about people who discover that their greatest strength lies not in what they can accomplish alone, but in what they can create when they allow others to be part of their journey. These are the stories that remind us that every community, whether it's a neighborhood, a family, or even the people who gather here each week to share in these moments of human connection, is strengthened when we recognize that everyone has something valuable to offer. And as Maria Santos was about to learn, sometimes the most dangerous thing about accepting help isn't that you might become dependent on it, but that you might discover you deserve it. Because the plan that David Chen had so carefully constructed was about to collide with a reality he hadn't anticipated, Maria's fierce determination to understand exactly who was trying to change her life and why. Maria Santos had learned to trust her instincts during 3 years of navigating poverty, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that something was wrong. Not wrong in a dangerous way, but wrong in a way that threatened the careful balance of self-reliance she'd built her life around. Good fortune didn't cascade like this, not for people like her, not without strings attached that would reveal themselves when she could least afford to cut them. She'd spent the night making lists, a habit developed during her incomplete nursing training, where documentation could mean the difference between life and death. On one side of her notebook, she wrote down every unexpected opportunity that had materialized in the past 24 hours. On the other side, she began mapping connections, looking for the pattern that would explain how her life had suddenly shifted from barely surviving to almost thriving. The first connection Maria discovered was architectural. The office building where she'd been offered the supervisor position was managed by Riverside Property Solutions. The hospital that had discovered billing errors in her favor was part of the Riverside Medical Network. Even Martinez Auto Repair, where her car had miraculously qualified for a recall, was located in a strip mall owned by Riverside Commercial Properties. Maria had cleaned enough corporate offices to understand how business ownership worked, shell companies, subsidiaries, and holding corporations that made it nearly impossible to trace who actually controlled what. But she'd also learned to read the small print on the plaques in executive suites, and the name that kept appearing in various forms was always some variation of Chen Holdings or Chen Investment Group. By 7 a.m., Maria had made a decision that would unravel David's carefully constructed plan. Instead of accepting the supervisor position immediately, she would conduct her own investigation. She would find out who was behind these coincidences, and more importantly, she would discover what they wanted in return. David Chen was experiencing a form of stress he'd never encountered in 20 years of business dealings. Corporate negotiations had clear rules. Everyone knew they were adversaries, everyone expected strategic maneuvering, and everyone understood that victory went to whoever was more prepared and ruthless. But helping someone who didn't know they were being helped operated by entirely different rules, rules that David was discovering he didn't understand. Marcus Rivera had called with disturbing news. Maria Santos hadn't immediately accepted the supervisor position. Instead, she'd asked for time to consider the offer and had requested additional information about the company's ownership structure and employee policies. These weren't the questions of someone grateful for an unexpected opportunity, these were the questions of someone conducting due diligence. Worse, the school had reported that Maria had scheduled a meeting with Dr. Patricia Hill to discuss Sofia's sudden academic opportunities. She wanted to understand why her daughter had been selected now, why the transportation program had been implemented so quickly, and what obligations would come with accepting advanced placement. David found himself in the unprecedented position of hoping his plan would fail before it succeeded. Maria's investigation threatened to expose not just his involvement, but the elaborate network of favors, payments, and strategic manipulations he'd used to create her opportunities. If she discovered the truth, David realized, she would likely reject everything he'd arranged, leaving her family worse off than before. David's decision to visit Murphy's diner was impulsive, driven by the growing certainty that his careful planning was about to collapse in spectacular fashion. He told himself he was simply conducting reconnaissance, checking on Maria's state of mind before she made any irreversible decisions about his offers. But the moment David walked through the diner's door, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. Maria Santos was behind the counter, her back turned as she prepared coffee orders, but her posture was rigid with the kind of tension that comes from being constantly watched. Every other customer in the diner seemed to sense it too. Conversations were quieter, glances more furtive. When Maria turned around and saw David standing by the entrance, her expression was everything he'd feared and nothing he'd prepared for. There was no gratitude, no curiosity, no warmth. There was only the cold, calculating stare of someone who had identified a threat and was preparing to neutralize it. Maria approached David's booth with the professionalism of someone who had perfected customer service as survival skill, but her voice carried an undertone that made every word sound like an accusation. She asked if he needed a menu, recommended the daily special, and poured his coffee with hands that never trembled, hands that had learned steadiness during 3 years of handling other people's needs while her own went unmet. David tried to make casual conversation, commenting on the diner's atmosphere, the quality of the coffee, the friendliness of the staff. But every word felt like evidence in a trial he didn't understand he was already losing. Maria's responses were perfectly polite and completely impersonal, the way she might speak to any stranger who had wandered into her workplace. Then Maria did something that stopped David's heart. She placed his check on the table face down, but when he turned it over, there was writing on the back in careful script. "I know what you're doing. We need to talk. After my shift. 3 p.m. The park across from Sofia's school." Meanwhile, at Riverside Elementary, Maria Santos was having a conversation with her teacher that would complicate David's plan in ways he could never have anticipated. Mrs. Patterson had asked Sofia how she felt about the possibility of joining the advanced academic program, and Sofia's response revealed a level of emotional intelligence that no standardized test could measure. Sofia told her teacher that she was excited about the new opportunities, but worried about her mama. The jobs and school programs and car repairs that had suddenly appeared felt like the kind of help that might disappear just as quickly. Sofia had learned at age 7 that good things in their life were usually temporary, and she was afraid that accepting too much help would make the loss hurt worse when it inevitably came. More concerning, Sofia had begun asking questions about the kind man from the grocery store who had talked to her at the bus stop. She'd mentioned him to Mrs. Eleanor, describing his sad eyes and gentle voice, wondering if he was one of the angels her mama sometimes talked about, the people who appeared just when you needed them most. Mrs. Patterson, who had taught children for 15 years, recognized the signs of a child trying to make sense of adult complexities beyond her comprehension. Sofia was connecting dots that no 7-year-old should have to connect, trying to understand why strangers would want to help them and what price that help might carry. When Mrs. Patterson gently suggested that sometimes people help others simply because it feels good to be kind, Sofia's response broke the teacher's heart. "But Mama says that when things feel too good to be true, they usually are. And lately, everything feels too good to be true." Word travels fast in neighborhoods where people know each other's business because survival often depends on community awareness. Mrs. Eleanor had mentioned David's encounter with Sofia to her friend Rosa, who cleaned offices in the same building where Maria worked nights. Rosa had told her cousin Roberto at the auto repair shop, who remembered the expensive car that had been parked across the street when the recall specialist had called about Maria's Honda. Tom Rodriguez at the diner had started putting pieces together too. The job offer Maria had received had come from a company representative who knew remarkably specific details about her work ethic and reliability, details that could only have come from someone who'd been watching her closely. And the mysterious customer who'd been asking casual questions about Maria earlier that morning had been wearing a watch that cost more than Tom made in 6 months. By early afternoon, a network of protective concern had formed around Maria and Sofia Santos. It wasn't organized or official, just the natural response of people who'd learned to look out for each other in a neighborhood where looking out for each other often meant the difference between surviving and thriving. Mrs. Eleanor called Maria during her lunch break with a warning disguised as casual conversation. "Mija, there's been a man in an expensive suit asking questions around the neighborhood. Just thought you should know. In our experience, when wealthy strangers start showing interest in our families, it's usually for their benefit, not ours." As David sat in his Mercedes outside Riverside Elementary, 15 minutes early for his confrontation with Maria, he experienced something that all his business training had never prepared him for, genuine remorse about his own good intentions. He'd approached Maria's life like a problem to be solved, a strategic challenge to be conquered through superior resources and careful planning. But people weren't corporations to be acquired or markets to be penetrated. Maria Santos wasn't a struggling business that needed better management. She was a human being who'd built a life of dignity and purpose under circumstances that would have broken most people. And David was finally beginning to understand that his help, however well-intentioned, was a form of colonization. He thought about his daughter Emma, about Jennifer's accusation that he'd forgotten how to be generous with himself rather than just his money. Was this intervention any different? Was he trying to help Maria and Sofia, Or was he trying to purchase the feeling of being needed, the sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since his divorce? David's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Hospital billing department is asking questions about the account adjustments. School district wants documentation for the transportation program funding. Auto recall story is falling apart. Manufacturer has no record of the program. How do you want me to handle? The infrastructure of David's carefully constructed plan was beginning to collapse, and he realized that his greatest fear wasn't that Maria would reject his help, it was that she would accept it for the wrong reasons, or that her acceptance would change the very qualities that had made him want to help her in the first place. The park across from Sofia's school was small and worn, the kind of public space that served working families who couldn't afford private recreation. The playground equipment was older but well-maintained, the grass was patchy but recently mowed, and the bench where Maria Santos sat waiting was weathered but sturdy, much like everything else in her life. David approached slowly, aware that every step was taking him into territory where his wealth and influence offered no protection. Maria didn't stand when she saw him coming. She didn't smile or extend any of the social courtesies that usually greased his interactions with other people. She simply watched him approach with the calm intensity of someone who'd already made up her mind about how this conversation would go. When David sat down on the opposite end of the bench, maintaining respectful distance, Maria's first words cut through all his prepared explanations and rehearsed justifications. "My daughter thinks you might be an angel. She's 7 years old, so she still believes in that kind of thing. But I'm 32, and I know that when angels show up in expensive suits driving luxury cars, they're usually not from heaven." David tried to explain, starting with the grocery store encounter, his recognition of their struggle, his desire to help without interfering. But Maria cut him off with a gesture that was both gentle and final. "I know who you are, Mr. Chen. I know about your companies, your net worth, your divorce, your daughter. I know about every favor you called in, every string you pulled, every dollar you spent to manipulate my life without my knowledge or consent." The words hit David like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. Maria's voice remained calm, almost kind, as she continued, "What I don't know is why. What I don't understand is what you get out of making me into your personal charity project. Because in my experience, when people with everything decide to help people with nothing, it's usually about making themselves feel better, not about making us better." David's response surprised them both. Instead of defending his actions or explaining his motivations, he began to cry. Not the controlled emotional release of someone making a strategic display of vulnerability, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone confronting the collapse of their carefully constructed self-image. Through his tears, David began to tell Maria about Emma, about missing the school play, about the divorce that had taught him that money couldn't purchase presents. He told her about the loneliness of his penthouse apartment, about the hollow victory of business success that left him with no one to share it with. He told her about watching her return that milk and recognizing something in her sacrifice that he'd lost in his own life, the ability to put love before convenience. Maria listened without interrupting, her expressions softening from suspicion to something more complex, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. When David finally looked up, his expensive suit wrinkled and tear-stained. Maria's first words were unexpected. "Mr. Chen, I think you're trying to save the wrong person." And in that moment, sitting on a worn park bench while children played nearby and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across patchy grass, both David Chen and Maria Santos realized that the most profound transformations often begin not with grand gestures or careful plans, but with the simple, terrifying act of admitting that you don't know how to fix what's broken in your own life. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us that healing is never a one-way street, that in the act of helping others, we often discover the help we need ourselves. These moments of recognition, of shared vulnerability, of unexpected connection across the barriers that separate us, these are the stories that build communities, whether that's in a neighborhood park, a grocery store checkout line, or right here, where people gather each week to remember that every human story matters, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen when we finally stop trying to fix each other and start trying to understand each other instead. Because what happened next between David Chen and Maria Santos would challenge everything both of them believed about independence, dignity, and the courage it takes to let someone else matter in your life. In the silence that followed David's emotional collapse, Maria Santos made a decision that surprised them both. Instead of standing up and walking away, which would have been the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that protected her family from the complications that came with wealthy strangers and their problems, she moved closer on the bench. Not close enough to invade his space, but close enough to offer the kind of presence that she'd learned to give during countless nights when Sofia had nightmares or fears that couldn't be fixed with words alone. Maria's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the same gentle authority she used with her daughter when life required difficult truths. "Mr. Chen, my Sofia asked me once if God forgets about people. And I told her that sometimes God's plan just takes longer than we think it should, and sometimes He sends help in ways we don't expect. I think maybe I was wrong about the last part." David looked up, his eyes red but attentive, waiting for her to continue. Maria gazed across the playground where children were laughing on swings their parents had pushed countless times, where teenagers were sharing secrets on benches that had heard a generation of dreams, where life continued in all its messy, beautiful imperfection. "I think maybe God doesn't send help at all," Maria continued. "I think maybe He just puts people in each other's paths and waits to see if they're brave enough to be honest about what they need. Because helping someone isn't about having the right answers or the most money. It's about having the courage to admit that you don't know what you're doing either." What happened next was unlike any conversation David Chen had experienced in his 45 years of life. Maria didn't ask him about his business empire or his investment strategies or his plans for her family's future. Instead, she asked him about Emma. She wanted to know what his daughter was like, what made her laugh, what she dreamed about becoming when she grew up. David found himself talking about Emma in ways he'd never articulated, even to himself. He described her fierce independence, inherited from her mother but sharpened by his absence. He talked about her artwork, intricate drawings of imaginary worlds where fathers and daughters went on adventures together. He admitted that he'd kept every picture she'd ever sent him, but that he'd never told her how they made him feel proud and heartbroken in equal measure. Maria listened with the kind of attention that David had forgotten existed, not the strategic listening of business meetings where every word was evaluated for advantage, but the generous listening of someone who understood that sometimes being heard was more valuable than being advised. When David finished describing Emma's last drawing, a picture of a superhero who looked suspiciously like him flying through clouds to reach a little girl on the ground, Maria asked the question that changed everything. "When's the last time you told Emma that you're proud of her?" The question seemed simple, but David's answer revealed the depth of his paralysis. He couldn't remember. Somewhere between divorce proceedings and custody arrangements and the careful choreography of scheduled phone calls, he'd forgotten that love wasn't a limited resource that needed to be rationed and managed. Maria's response was gentle but transformative. "Mr. Chen, you want to help my family because you think we need saving. But maybe what Sofia and I need isn't someone to solve our problems. Maybe what we need is someone who understands that life is hard for everyone, just in different ways. And maybe what you need isn't to be a hero. Maybe you just need to be a father." The school bell's distant chime announced the end of Sofia's day, and within minutes, the park began filling with children and parents navigating the daily reunion ritual. Sofia Santos appeared at the park's edge, her small figure scanning the area for her mother with the automatic vigilance of a child who'd learned that adults didn't always show up when they promised. When Sofia spotted Maria on the bench next to David, her expression shifted through a complex sequence of emotions: relief at finding her mother, curiosity about the man from the grocery store, and something that looked like recognition, as if she'd been expecting this meeting without quite knowing why. Sofia approached with a careful dignity she'd inherited from her mother, greeting David politely but positioning herself close to Maria's side. Her presence changed the dynamic entirely, grounding both adults in the reality that whatever happened next would affect this 7-year-old who'd already learned too much about adult complications. David, looking at Sofia's intelligent eyes and remembering Emma's similar expression during their awkward video calls, made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of explaining his involvement in their recent good fortune or defending his actions, he simply asked Sofia if she would like to hear about his daughter. For the next 20 minutes, David told Sofia about Emma, about her love of art and her fear of thunderstorms, about her collection of stuffed animals that each had elaborate backstories, about her dream of becoming either a veterinarian or a superhero, depending on what the world needed more. Sofia listened with the intense focus she brought to everything, occasionally asking questions that revealed her remarkable emotional intelligence. When David finished, Sofia's response captured the essence of childhood wisdom. "She sounds lonely, like you. Maybe that's why you wanted to help us, because helping feels better than being sad." It wasn't an accusation or a judgment, just an observation delivered with the matter-of-fact kindness that children possess before the world teaches them to be more careful with truth. The school bell's distant chime announced the end of Sofia's day, and within minutes, the park began filling with children and parents navigating the daily reunion ritual. Maria Santos appeared at the park's edge, her small figure scanning the area for her mother with the automatic vigilance of a child who'd learned that adults didn't always show up when they promised. When Sofia spotted Maria on the bench next to David, her expression shifted through a complex sequence of emotions: relief at finding her mother, curiosity about the man from the grocery store, and something that looked like recognition, as if she'd been expecting this meeting without quite knowing why. Sofia approached with a careful dignity she'd inherited from her mother, greeting David politely but positioning herself close to Maria's side. Her presence changed the dynamic entirely, grounding both adults in the reality that whatever happened next would affect this 7-year-old who'd already learned too much about adult complications. David, looking at Sofia's intelligent eyes and remembering Emma's similar expression during their awkward video calls, made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of explaining his involvement in their recent good fortune or defending his actions, he simply asked Sofia if she would like to hear about his daughter. For the next 20 minutes, David told Sofia about Emma, about her love of art and her fear of thunderstorms, about her collection of stuffed animals that each had elaborate backstories, about her dream of becoming either a veterinarian or a superhero, depending on what the world needed more. Sofia listened with the intense focus she brought to everything, occasionally asking questions that revealed her remarkable emotional intelligence. When David finished, Sofia's response captured the essence of childhood wisdom. "She sounds lonely, like you. Maybe that's why you wanted to help us, because helping feels better than being sad." It wasn't an accusation or a judgment, just an observation delivered with the matter-of-fact kindness that children possess before the world teaches them to be more careful with truth. Faced with this circle of protective concern, David experienced something unprecedented in his adult life: accountability to people who had no reason to defer to his wealth or status. Mrs. Eleanor, Tom, and Roberto weren't impressed by his net worth or his business achievements. They were interested in only one question: what kind of person was he when success and money were removed from the equation? David's answer came not in words, but in actions that revealed who he was becoming rather than who he'd been. He pulled out his phone and, in front of everyone, called his assistant Marcus. The instructions he gave were simple but revolutionary: cancel all the elaborate interventions, reverse the anonymous donations, and restore Maria's situation to exactly what it had been before he'd interfered. But then David did something that shocked everyone present, including himself. He asked Maria if she would be willing to help him with something, not accept his help, but offer hers. He explained that he was trying to rebuild a relationship with his daughter but didn't know how to be present in someone else's life without trying to control or fix it. He wondered if Maria, who'd clearly mastered the art of loving someone without overwhelming them, might be willing to share what she'd learned. The request transformed the entire dynamic. Instead of David rescuing Maria, he was asking her to teach him something he desperately needed to know. Instead of charity flowing from wealth to poverty, knowledge and insight were flowing from experience to privilege. For the first time, the exchange felt genuinely reciprocal. Maria's response revealed why she'd survived 3 years of poverty without losing her dignity or her capacity for kindness. "Mr. Chen, I don't know if I can teach you how to be a father to Emma. But maybe we can figure it out together." Because Sofia could use more adults in her life who understand that caring about someone means showing up consistently, not just dramatically. What emerged from that park bench conversation wasn't the fairy tale rescue that David had originally envisioned, but something more complex and ultimately more valuable, a genuine friendship built on mutual need and reciprocal benefit. David would help Maria navigate the supervisor position she'd earned through her own merit, and Maria would help David learn how to be present in relationships without trying to manage them. Sofia would benefit from the academic opportunities that her intelligence had legitimately qualified her for, but David would benefit equally from having a child in his life who could teach him about resilience, gratitude, and the kind of joy that comes from small victories rather than grand achievements. Mrs. Eleanor, Tom, and Roberto became not just witnesses to this arrangement but active participants in a support network that included everyone. David's resources would be available when needed, but channeled through community wisdom rather than individual decision-making. His wealth would become a tool for collective problem-solving rather than personal control. The shocking thing that David Chen did next wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic rescue. It was something far more radical. He learned how to be helped. He accepted Mrs. Eleanor's invitation to Sunday dinners where Sofia could meet someone who understood that family isn't defined by blood or legal documents but by consistent presence and mutual care. He agreed to Tom's suggestion that he work a few shifts at the diner, not as charity or publicity, but because being useful in small ways would teach him skills he'd never learned in boardrooms. 6 months after that grocery store encounter, Maria Santos was thriving in her supervisor position, leading a team of maintenance professionals with the same quiet competence she'd brought to single motherhood. Sofia was excelling in the advanced academic program, but more importantly, she was still the generous, observant child she'd always been, now with additional adults who understood that nurturing her gifts meant preserving her heart. David Chen had sold his penthouse apartment and moved to a smaller place in Maria's neighborhood, not because he was trying to insert himself into their lives, but because he'd discovered that community wasn't something you visited, it was something you participated in daily. His relationship with Emma had transformed from scheduled calls to ongoing conversation, built on the foundation of vulnerability he'd learned from watching how Maria loved Sofia. But the most profound change was invisible to outside observers. David had learned the difference between charity and friendship, between helping and controlling, between solving someone else's problems and creating space for mutual support. Maria had learned that accepting help didn't diminish her strength but could multiply it when offered by people who understood that today's helper might be tomorrow's person in need. The grocery store encounter that had started everything became a weekly ritual, not because anyone needed to return milk anymore, but because it had become the place where an unlikely family gathered to do ordinary shopping while celebrating the extraordinary fact that they'd found each other. This story began with a millionaire who thought he could buy his way back to feeling useful, and a single mother who believed she had to carry everything alone. It ends with both of them understanding that the most profound transformations happen not when someone saves us, but when we discover we have something valuable to offer each other. These are the stories that remind us why community matters, not just the place where we live, but the people who choose to show up consistently in each other's lives. Whether that's in a neighborhood grocery store, around a dinner table, or right here, where people gather each week to remember that every human story contains lessons about courage, connection, and the countless ways we can matter to each other. So, as you think about David and Maria's story, consider sharing where you're watching from tonight, And tell us about a time when someone surprised you not with what they could give you, but with what they were willing to learn from you. Because sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin when we realize that everyone has something to teach, and everyone has something to learn, and the space between those two truths is where real community lives. What shocked everyone about what David Chen did next wasn't that a wealthy man helped a struggling family. What shocked everyone was that he learned how to let them help him back. And in a world that often feels divided by what we have or don't have, that might be the most revolutionary thing of all. The radical act of recognizing that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, has something precious to offer if we're humble enough to receive it. Because the greatest gift we can give each other isn't what we can afford to share. It's the recognition that we're all more complete when we're connected, and that sometimes the people who seem to need the most help are actually the ones with the most to teach us about what it means to be truly wealthy. If this story warmed your heart as I am confident it did, please hit that subscription button now. Click the notification button so you don't miss the next heartwarming story coming up tomorrow. Also like and share this video. I'd be seeing you tomorrow. Take care.